to our 6-part study of the story of the church in the 20th century. Thank you so much for joining in. For those of you that have been liking and sharing these videos, whether you're watching on my Facebook page, our church's Facebook page, my YouTube page, our church's YouTube page, thank you so much for doing that. We've got a lot of really positive response because church history is not something that we necessarily study a lot, and finding that there's some interest. Well, tonight our study of the Christian story in the 20th century takes us into some of the darkest moments of human history. We are going to descend tonight right into the very teeth of the Nazi final solution to the extermination camps of the Holocaust. But our study is also going to take us into one of the most well-loved and well-known believers of the 20th century, the daughter of a Dutch watchmaker, Corrie Ten Boom. And Corrie Ten Boom's life was a life of incredible suffering, but also matched by an incredible testimony to God's faithfulness and the grace of God that produces forgiveness. And I think that understanding her life helps us to understand an important lesson about the church's witness in the 20th century, because the church in the 20th century was a suffering community. It's estimated that from Turkey to Africa and different points in between, 65% of the martyrs of the Christian faith lived and lost their lives in the 20th century. Think about that fact. 65% of all people throughout history who've died for the name of Jesus died from 1900 to 1999. The world, the modern world, particular with its political upheaval, with its communist revolutions, with the Islamic caliphates, it has not been kind to Christians. Now, today I know that our lives maybe are mostly untouched from true persecution and the kind of suffering that Corrie Ten Boom and others like her experienced. But that has not been the case for many people, and it wasn't the case for Corrie Ten Boom. But truly, our story tonight begins far away from the noisy and joyful watch repair shop of Caspar Ten Boom, where his youngest daughter would ultimately learn the family trade and rise to some level of celebrity. We have to start years before the death camps and Kristallnacht or the German Blitzkrieg to really understand how the life of one simple Christian family would be swept away in so much suffering. And so the place to begin is in Paris, France, the summer of 1919. For 4 years, the Great War, the war to end all wars, had ravaged and altered the European way of life. Civilized nations had been reduced just to downright barbarism as men fought one another in trenches and slaughtered each other literally by the millions in places like Verdun or the Somme. Bullets had taken lives. Gas had damaged people's nerves. The minds of soldiers had been forever twisted as they endured the horror of artillery bombardments. And by 1918, Europe was sick of war. And of course, most of us know that on November the 11th, 1918, an armistice came and the war ended. And so in the summer of 1919, the governments of Europe came together in Paris, France to help carve out the details of their new world. And it was made clear in Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles that Germany would take the blame as the primary antagonist of World War I. And Germany would take on herself the burden of paying reparations to her former enemies. The logic was that for Germany to take her place in the modern world, she had done the crime, so she had to do the time. Here's what Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles says. The Allied and associated governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies, end quote. Now, as you can imagine, this was a terrible disgrace to the German people, and it would become just an unbearable strain on the national economy of Germany until, like most modern economies, it collapsed in the Great Depression of the 1920s and 1930s. And in that Great Depression, and in that sense of national shame, and in that economic crisis, there were a generation of Germans who were growing up who were looking for hope. And a message of hope began to arise in Germany from an unlikely source, promising a new Germany, a unified Germany, a Germany that was working harder and producing more, a Germany with a better, stronger military. And that voice, of course, belonged to a World War I veteran from Austria, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler, who through a very unusual series of events would rise to power in Germany and would become Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And now, tonight, we have the benefit of hindsight of looking back on the story of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Holocaust. We know the terrible suffering and the violence and the evil brought into the world through this man. But to people who lived through that in the 1930s in Europe, they viewed Adolf Hitler as a German anomaly, a German problem, who would surely be handled by the German people. And that was the belief of Corrie Ten Boom and his family. The Ten Boom family were staples in the Dutch city of Haarlem. Casper and his father were known to the entire community as watchmakers who sold their goods and practiced their craft right out of their tall, narrow home. Corrie Ten Boom was a man of devout faith. He was a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, and he started every day exactly the same way he ended every day, by reading his Bible with his family. Sometimes as a watchmaker, he would become so engrossed in his work that he would lose track of time and lose himself in prayer. And in her autobiography, The Hiding Place, which you ought to read, Corrie Ten Boom wrote about her father that sometimes she would walk in to see him laboring over a difficult watch or a clock, and he would be praying to the Lord, Lord, you put the atoms in motion. Help me to put this watch back together. Corrie Ten Boom was called Opa, or grandfather, to the city's children. He was a gentleman, and he loved his work so much that sometimes he would just forget to charge for it. And Corrie seems to write that even though he was a very, very skilled watch repairman and watchmaker, he wasn't a great businessman, and it never really made an incredible living, even though God certainly blessed their home. And his work and his family and his faith, that was his life. And his daughters lived at home with him, two of them. They were unmarried. And Corrie, his daughter, wrote about herself in 1937. She said, quote, I was 45 years old, unmarried, waistline long since vanished, end quote. By 1937, Adolf Hitler was becoming a worrisome figure on the international scene. But to the people of Holland, who are smoking their cigars and fixing their watches, this was still a German problem that would be handled by somebody else. After all, they felt that way because Holland had been neutral in World War I and was determined to remain so again. So they were very optimistic, or cautiously optimistic, about the future, but even a simple watchmaker could tell that things were changing in the world. Corrie Ten Boom had conducted business with Jewish watchmakers in Germany. He traded with them, and he noticed that all of a sudden they disappeared. Their businesses were shut down. They could not be contacted. Corrie had a brother, Wilhelm, a pastor, worked as a missionary of sorts within the Dutch Reformed Church, reaching out to the Jews. And through what he was reporting to them, they began to understand that a dark cloud was settling in on the European continent. Of course, we know the clouds broke on September the 1st, 1939, when Adolf Hitler's forces invaded Poland. And on the evening of May the 9th, 1940, the Ten Boom family had their Bible reading. They said their prayers. They gathered around their radio to hear a speech from the Dutch Prime Minister. And he assured the people of Holland that their neutrality would be respected by both sides of this new war, and that the Dutch people would be safe. Corrie Ten Boom heard this. Corrie said he put out his cigar in the ashtray, got up to go to bed, and he said to his daughters, Corrie and Betsy, my dears, I'm sorry for all Dutchmen who do not know the power of God. For we will be beaten, but he will not. He was convinced that Germany would come and that Holland would pay the price for it. And they came that night. The Ten Booms awoke to bombs falling on Amsterdam. And Corrie and Betsy prayed over their family's piano bench. And Corrie remarks that while they prayed for their country, while they prayed for their queen, she heard her sister Betsy praying for the Germans, praying that God would forgive their enemies. Well, in less than a week, Holland would be occupied German territory. And at first, Corrie says that life went on pretty much unchanged for the Ten Boom family. In fact, she says that business was probably better than ever because now there are German soldiers everywhere in the streets, and they're buying jewelry for their girlfriends or having their watches repaired or buying gifts for their moms back home. She said there's plenty of food. There was a curfew, but when you are 50-something-year-old spinster and you live with your 70-something-year-old father, you don't worry too much about a curfew. So they would go about their lives, repair their watches, read their Bible, say their prayers, and go to bed, and get up and do it again the next day. Of course, to move about, the Germans demanded you had an identification card, and the radio would only play these glowing reports about German military victories, and that irritated the Dutch people, as you can imagine. They loved their country, and they hated to see her demoralized, but listening to the radio broadcast would set the stage for one of the first complexities of Corrie Ten Boom's new life. Corrie Ten Boom would become a life-saving heroine, but she was a conflicted hero. And it's during this problem with the radio that she starts to enter into some of the conflict of doing the right thing in a world that's gone wrong because she lies. They were only allowed to have one radio in the home, but they had two. And they would secretly listen to broadcasts from the Dutch resistance to get truth and to get information. And one day she was asked by a German army clerk if she owned a radio. And she replied with a curt no. She would write this: "Only as I walked out of the building did I begin to tremble. Not because for the first time in my life I had told a conscious lie, but because it had been so dreadfully easy." That quote from Corrie Ten Boom shows you much about her faith and her own self-awareness. She was alert to the truth about her own struggles in her walk with God, even while she was going to be used greatly by Him. One night, during this period of Corrie's life, she recounts this incredible story as she's unable to sleep as British planes and German fighter planes warred overhead as they battled for the airfields around Amsterdam. And she went downstairs to have tea and talk with her sister. And while they just chatted and talked, a sudden explosion just rattled all the dishes in the cupboard. Well, she settled down and went back to bed, and in the darkness of her room, she began to feel for her place in her bed. And she put her hand on something cold and dark and sharp and metallic, and she cut her hand, and she flipped the light on, and there was a piece of shrapnel laying right in the middle of her pillow from that explosion. And she said to her sister, Betsy, if I hadn't heard you in the kitchen, knowing that she would have been in the bed and would have been killed. But then her sister Betsy replied, don't say it, Corrie. There are no ifs in God's world. And there are no places that are safer than other places. Then her sister said this, it's incredible. The center of His will is our only safety. Betsy Ten Boom would die in a concentration camp in Germany. Their father, Casper, would never make it to a concentration camp. He would die in a hospital on a stretcher in the hallway 9 days after he was arrested. How is it that this simple family ended up on the wrong side of the Nazi war machine? Well, in some ways, that change was very gradual. Now, they went about their lives and they began to notice that Jewish people would disappear from town. They would notice that their Jewish friends would have to walk through town with those bright yellow stars sewn on their coats. They would see mass gatherings of Jewish people on street corners being placed in the back of large trucks by German soldiers. And at one such sight, her father said to her, those poor people. And she assumed he meant the Jews, but then he said, I pity the Germans, Corrie. I pity the Germans. They have touched the apple of God's eye. But in other ways, the Ten Booms were kind of thrust into this conspiracy very, very suddenly. One day, the man who owned a fur shop across the road from them, who was Jewish, was harassed by the Germans. His shop was dismantled. He was thrown out in the road, but he found refuge with the Ten Boom family. And she reached out to her nephew, Kik, who had contacts with the Dutch underground. And he assured her that he could find a safe place for their neighbor out in the country away from the Germans. But he remarked to her, if you're going to work with the underground, Tante Corrie, Aunt Corrie, you're going to have to learn not to ask questions. The underground. In many ways, that's what Corrie Ten Boom became. She became a member of the underground. And she was not so much a freedom fighter, but she was a doorway of escape to people who were fleeing death, carrying out our Lord's command to love your neighbor as yourself to its furthest possible conclusion. She says that at 7:55 one night, a knock came to the door, and a well-dressed woman introduced herself and said, my name is Kleermacher. I am a Jew. She was welcomed into the Ten Boom home. 2 nights later, there was an elderly couple that came with the same story. Sometime after that was an elderly woman. And on as their home began to fill up with people who were fleeing for their lives. And the plan never was to have these people stay in their homes permanently. The plan was to piece together some kind of plan to get these people out of town, to get them in the country, to get them away from the watchful eye of the Germans. And the primary way they did that was by hoarding up ration cards. People needed to eat, and for people in the country to hide Jews, they would often have to be paid with ration cards, and there was all kinds of conspiracy and probably even some fraud to get those, but they were saving lives. But as the Ten Booms attracted the attention of the Dutch resistance, it became really clear that they were going to need help. And so, under cover of disguise, a secret room was built in Corrie's bedroom, really behind her bed, just a few feet by a few feet, where the Jews could hide when the Gestapo would come and make their raids. And under incredible hardship for a number of years, that's exactly what they did. They practiced being raided, living on the edge, waiting for the day when the knock would come to the door and a German soldier would be standing there and their home would be combed through, and who knew what would come next. So they fought to stay secret. They connived in every possible way to save lives. In one response to one particular lie that Corrie had to tell during this time, her father said, "And yet whatever came from your lips, Corrie, I am sure it was spoken in love." But then she thought to herself about love. She said, love. How did one show it? How could God himself show truth and love at the same time in a world like this? Think about that question. Think about the depth of that. The Nazis have invaded her country. She's risking her life to protect people from death. How could God himself show truth and love at the same time in a world like this? Here's her answer. By dying. It's powerful. The Ten Booms were laying down their lives the way Christ had laid down his life, knowing that they would be safe in him because he had given all to save them. But during all this time, the watch repair shop kept humming right along, and eventually an illegal telephone would be installed and secret messages were passed along. And here's what they did. They would say things like this: "We have a woman's watch here that needs repairing, but I can't find a mainspring. Do you know who might have one?" And that meant we need a hiding place for a Jewish woman. Or, "We have a man's watch here that is giving us trouble. For one thing, the face is very old-fashioned. That is, a man with obviously Jewish features needs a place to hide." This was her life, risking her life and living her life for the sake of hurting. The raid came at the end of February in 1944. Word was out, the gig was up, and the Gestapo raided the Ten Boom family home, and the Jews made it to the secret room just as a Gestapo agent pulled Corrie out of bed, demanding that she get dressed. She was questioned, she was beaten, and she was asked repeatedly, "Where are the Jews? Where do you have the ration cards? Where is the secret room?" And yet the Nazis never found it. But that was the last that she would see her home for months. She was arrested with her sister Betsy and her father and 35 other people who had the misfortune of showing up at their home while the Gestapo was there. These people were interviewed, questioned, interrogated repeatedly, and her father was almost released as he was questioned by a guard, and the guard said, "I'd like to send you home. Will you assure me that you won't cause any more trouble?" But here's how Casper Ten Boom replied: "If I go home today, tomorrow I will open my door again to any man in need who knocks." Eventually, as men and women were separated from one another to be transferred to prison, Corrie saw her father for the last time, and she cried out, "God be with you." And he said, "And with you, daughters." So initially, Corrie was imprisoned at a prison in The Hague. And there she battled a pretty serious sickness. I believe it was pneumonia. She suffered in isolation just to keep from infecting other inmates. A nurse was able to sneak a Bible to her, an amazing act of God's provision. That God provided this Bible for her, not just for her sanity, not just, for her memories from a pre-war world, but God used that Bible for her very spiritual nourishment. Here's what she wrote about this time, quote, "As my health returned, I was able to use my eyes longer. I had been sustaining myself from my scriptures, a verse at a time. Now, like a starving man, I gulped entire gospels at a reading, seeing whole the magnificent drama of salvation. And as I did, an incredible thought prickled the back of my neck. Was it possible that all of this that seemed so wasteful and so needless, this war, Schwenningen prison," that's where she was in prison, Schwenningen prison, this very cell, none of it was unforeseen or accidental. Could it be part of the pattern first revealed in the Gospels? Hadn't Jesus, and here my reading became intent indeed, hadn't Jesus been defeated as utterly and unarguably as our little group and poor small plans had been? But if the gospel were truly the pattern of God's activity, then defeat was only the beginning. I would look around at the bare little cell and wonder what conceivable victory could come from a place like this. So like many prisoners, she started passing the time on the wall. She wrote down significant dates. February the 28th, 1944, arrest. February the 29th, 1944, transport to Schwenningen. March 16th, 1944, beginning of solitary. April 15th, 1944, my birthday in prison. April 20th, 1944, was also a big day in the prison because it was Adolf Hitler's birthday. And the entire staff evidently stopped working to celebrate this birthday party. And so the inmates began to yell at one another, questions and pass messages to each other. And from somewhere down the long, lonely hall, Corrie Ten Boom heard the words, quote, "Betsy Ten Boom is in cell 312. She said to tell you that God is good." That's an amazing testimony to their awareness of the goodness of God and the power of the gospel that is bringing life out of death. But she heard no word from her father. She did receive word from another sister that was on the outside who had sent a secret message, and written underneath the stamp on the envelope, which was something the Dutch resistance did, was this phrase: "All the watches in your closet are safe." All of the Jews hidden in the Ten Boom home made it safely through the raid. But from the sister also came the news about her father, that he had died in a hospital alone. But she wrote on the wall of her cell, March the 9th, 1944, "Father, released." He had made it home, even from a Nazi prison. Eventually, Corrie would sit for a hearing of sorts with a Nazi lieutenant by the name of Roms. She was questioned by him, but apparently he didn't have a lot of accurate information about her crimes, and so it kind of proved fruitless. But he started to ask her about other activities, and she didn't understand what he meant. And so before the war, Corrie Ten Boom had been doing a special church-type service for handicapped people and handicapped children, and she thought that when he asked about other activities, that's what he meant. So she started to reply about that. And then this Nazi lieutenant, you can imagine this cold, severe man with this, death's head emblem on his gray military cap. He balked at this, and he says, "What a waste of time and energy. If you want converts, surely one normal person is worth all the half-wits in the world." But then she asked this Nazi lieutenant, she says, "May I tell you the truth, Lieutenant?" He says, "Well, this hearing, Miss Ten Boom, is predicated on the assumption that you will do me that honor." Then she says, "The truth, sir, is that God's viewpoint is sometimes different from ours. So different that we could never guess at it unless he had given us a book which tells us such things. In the Bible, I learned that God values us not for our strength or our brains, but simply because he's made us. Who knows? In his eyes, a half-wit may be worth more than a watchmaker or a lieutenant." That was the end of the questioning with the Nazi lieutenant. But amazingly, it wasn't the end of their conversations. He would meet with Corrie. He would talk about his fears for the safety of his family that still lived in Germany. He would talk about the darkness he experienced in his own soul. And she was faithful to share the gospel with him. Just another reason why you need to read The Hiding Place by Corrie Ten Boom. But Betsy and Corrie would be transferred to Wut, and ultimately, as they feared, they would be transferred into the heart of Germany to the extermination camp Ravensbrück. And understand that by the end of 1944, the vast number of people, the Jews and Gypsies and communists, political prisoners, that were held by the Germans in their concentration camps had become an incredible liability. These are people that had to be fed at least enough so that they could work, and that would take food from other people. These were people that had to be guarded, and that would take manpower from the war effort. These were people that needed to be hidden as the Allies got closer into Germany. And as the Allies began to press into Germany from both east and west, the Germans would either have to push these prisoners deeper into Germany, or they would just have to execute them. And it was during the war, there were something like 130,000 women passed through the Ravensbrück concentration camp. And mostly they labored there making parts for V-2 rockets produced by Siemens. But they also did hard manual labor. They suffered greatly and they died in large numbers. And one of the most horrific stories from the hiding place is Corrie tells that one day the women were summoned out for roll call. And as they went through the names of all of the women at the concentration camp, they heard at the men's concentration camp, which was basically right next door, they heard a similar roll call, and then they heard just one rifle volley after another as these men were just executed in the broad daylight just for simply existing. And you had these women who were there hearing the names of their husbands and then hearing gunshots. It's just a terrible, terrible scene. The women at Ravensbrück starved. They were beaten. They slept on mattresses made of straw that were literally rotten and filled with lice and fleas. But Corrie and Betsy Ten Boom viewed this as a place of ministry. They managed, really by a series of true miracles and just really unlikely oversights. The Nazis were always efficient and vigilant in everything that they did, but they made some mistakes when it comes to the Ten Boom. They were able to get Bibles and able to continue to teach the Word of God and pray for the women with them. And here's how Corrie describes these worship services they had in the barracks of a Nazi concentration camp. Back at the barracks, she says, we formed yet another line, she says, with there never being an end to columns and weights, to receive our ladle of turnip soup in the center room. Then as quickly as we could for the press of people, Betsy and I made our way to the rear of the dormitory room where we held our worship service. And around our own platform area, there was not enough light to read the Bible. But back here, a small light bulb cast a wan yellow circle on the wall. And here, an ever larger group of women gathered. There were services like no others, these times in Barracks 28. A single meeting that might include a recital of the Magnificat in Latin by a group of Russian Catholics, a whispered hymn by some Lutherans, and a sotto voice chant by Eastern Orthodox women. With each moment, the crowd around us would swell, packing the nearby platforms, hanging over the edges until the high structures groaned or swayed. At last, either Betsy or I would open the Bible, and I would know that again in darkness, God's truth shines most clear. And yet, for some reason, the guards never interfered. Now, understand that these guards in these concentration camps, these were people that robbed, interrogated, forced their prisoners to stand naked, examined them, pushed them in the lines, forced them through paperwork over and over and over again. But for some reason, the Germans left them alone in their barracks. They never could figure out why. Until Betsy had been hospitalized sometime later, and she overheard the guards talking, but they would not go into that particular barracks because the fleas were so bad. And earlier, Corrie had complained to Betsy about the fleas, and yet Betsy had encouraged her, Corrie, in everything give thanks, even for the fleas. And now God had used this terrible parasite to advance his word, just as he was using this terrible suffering to share the gospel. But for Corrie in the concentration camp, the enemy was not without. It was within. The problem wasn't the Germans. The problem was her heart. She's fighting to stand on the inside of the column when women are being assaulted by the rain or they're, she struggled to share a sheet with her fellow prisoners. She says that her ministry became ineffective and her joy left her. And finally, God showed her that she needed this thorn so that she would not rest in her strength. She would be renewed, but while her spiritual life was revitalized, her sister Betsy's health was failing. Betsy would pass away on December the 16th, 1944, and would enter heaven from the hospital ward of Ravensbrück extermination camp. But in her last days, she said this to Corrie. She said, we must tell people what we have learned here. We must tell them that there is no pit so deep that he is not deeper still. They will listen to us, Corrie, because we have been here. We must tell them that there is no pit so deep that he is not deeper still. They will listen to us, Corrie, because we have been here. That was December the 16th, 1944, her sister passed. But before she passed, she told Corrie that they would be free by the first of the year. And just a few days later, during roll call, Corrie Ten Boom was unexpectedly pulled to the side and given a piece of paper that had her name, her birth date on it, and with the words certificate of discharge. And after she would receive medical clearance, she was on a train back to Holland. The Allies liberated Holland in May, and Corrie opened her heart and gave her life to helping people who had suffered through the war. And in 1959, She would return to Ravensbrück concentration camp for a special service honoring the 96,000 people who had died there. And there in 1959, years after the war, she learned that her release had been really a mistake. All of the women her age were sent to the gas chamber just a week after she was released. And yet God spared her so she could travel and speak and serve and share the gospel on every continent except Antarctica. She eventually would move to California, and she would pass away in 1983 on her 91st birthday, leaving behind an incredible story of grace and forgiveness. So what should we learn from the life of Corrie Ten Boom? I think there are a couple of things that are vital for all of our relationship with the Lord. The first is that Jesus redefines suffering. The Ten Boom family understood by faith that Jesus would turn darkness into light, that he would redeem their pain, that suffering was not final, even if it brought about the finality of death. They endured with the hope that Jesus suffered with his people. I would encourage you, if you can endure it, to read The Hiding Place by Corrie Ten Boom, and then immediately read, and both books are relatively brief, read the memoir of Elie Wiesel and his experience in the Nazi Holocaust night, and see the difference between how an observant Jewish man, a teenager at the time, and a Christian woman viewed the Holocaust. It's remarkable. In fact, there's one scene where one of his fellow Jews actually tells Elie Wiesel that he has more faith in Hitler than in God, because Hitler was the only one who kept all of his promises to the Jewish people. Elie Wiesel's memoir is a dark book. It's an important book, but it's a dark book. And the difference between the darkness of Elie Wiesel's experience in the Holocaust and Corrie Ten Boom's experience in the Holocaust is that she understood the truth and the stability of the cross. Suffering will always lead us to despair if we are not anchored to the cross. Jesus redefined suffering. We learned that from the life of Corrie Ten Boom. But we also learned that we can forgive people no matter what. One of the most well-known stories of the life of Corrie Ten Boom comes just right after her experience in the Holocaust. And she was beginning to travel and speak in churches, and she was speaking at a church in Munich, Germany. Here's how she recounts this story. She said, "It was at a church in Munich that I saw her. A balding, heavy-set man, a gray overcoat, a brown felt hat clutched between his hands. People were filing out of the basement room where I had just spoken, moving along the rows of wooden chairs to the door at the rear. It was 1947, and I'd come from Holland to defeated Germany with the message that God forgives. And it was the truth they most needed to hear in that bitter, bombed-out land. And I gave them my favorite mental picture. Maybe because the sea is never far from a Hollander's mind, I like to think that that's where forgiven sins were thrown. She says, when we confess our sins, God casts them into the deepest ocean, gone forever. This is what she's preaching to the German people as they carry the guilt in their national conscience after World War II. God cast your sin into the deepest ocean. She said, the solemn faces stared back at me, not quite daring to believe. There were never questions after a talk in Germany in 1947. People stood up in silence collected their wraps, and in silence left the room. And that's when I saw him, working his way forward against the others. One moment, I saw the overcoat and the brown hat. The next, a blue uniform and a visored cap with its skull and crossbones. It came back with a rush. The huge room with its harsh overhead lights. The pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the floor. The shame of walking naked past this man. I could see my sister's frail form ahead of me, ribs sharp beneath the parchment skin. Betsy, how thin you were. Now he was in front of me, his hand thrust out. A fine message, Fraulein. How good it is to know that, as you say, all our sins are at the bottom of the sea. And I, who had spoken so glibly of forgiveness, fumbled in my pocketbook rather than take that hand. He would not remember me. I mean, of course, how could he remember one prisoner among thousands of women? But I remembered him and the leather crop swinging from his belt. It was the first time since my release that I had been face to face with one of my captors, and my blood seemed to freeze. You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk, he would say. I was a guard there. No, he did not remember me. But since that time, he went on, I've become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me for all the cruel things I did there. But I would like to hear it from your lips as well, Fraulein. And the hand came out. Will you forgive me? And I stood there. I, whose sins had every day to be forgiven. I could not. She said Betsy had died in that place. Could he erase her slow, terrible death simply for the asking? It could not have been many seconds that he stood there, hand held out, but to me it seemed hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing I ever had to do. For I had to do it. I knew that. The message that God forgives has a prior condition, that we forgive those who have injured us. If you do not forgive men their trespasses, Jesus says, neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses. I knew it not only as a commandment of God, but as a daily experience. Since the end of the war, I had had a home in Holland for victims of Nazi brutality. Those who were able to forgive their former enemies were able also to return to the outside world and rebuild their lives, no matter what the physical scars. Those who nursed their bitterness remained invalids. It was as simple and as horrible as that. And what Corrie's referring to there is that after the war, she had a home where she ministered to people who had been through the Holocaust, who had suffered through the war. And she says this, and still I stood there with coldness, clutching my heart. But forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. Jesus, help me, I prayed silently. I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You supply the feeling. And so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one stretched out to me. And as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, sprang into our joined hands. And then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried, with all my heart. For a long moment, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. I had never known God's love so intensely as I did then. From the life of Corrie Ten Boom, we learned that Jesus redefines suffering. And we learned that Jesus empowers us to forgive no matter what. And Corrie Ten Boom is a woman who lived through the very worst of the 20th century, but showed the grace of God in the middle of all of that. And as the church struggled in the 20th century and still struggles to find its place in a modern world that can be very, very cruel, the life of Corrie Ten Boom shows us exactly how God transforms the world. And he does it through the ordinary faithfulness of God's people. And he does it through incredible acts of forgiveness, powered by grace, as we live lives shaped by the gospel.